Hey everyone, I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast.
Debating Mathy topics and Mathy pedagogy with Mathy people just like you.
Let's get into this month's debate.
We are excited today to talk about textbooks.
Yeah, you heard that right. Textbooks. Some of you may have been handed a textbook that you were instructed to follow. Others may have never had a textbook offered to them ever.
So if you're given a textbook, should you be following it and how much? Or if you don't have one, should you go find one?
This sounded like a great topic for a debate. So here we are today to debate the resolution. Teachers should follow the textbook.
So let's meet our debaters. Here arguing that we should follow the textbook, we have two awesome educators. And first up is a teacher who's been in education since 2011, teaching public, private, and charter schools, who also spent some time as an education researcher, a former Math for America fellow, and frequent faculty member of Beam in New York City and LA, who likes fuzzy flannels and precise definitions. It's Gabe Davis. Hi, Gabe.
Hello. Welcome.
Yeah, glad to have you here. Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Absolutely. So I am coming to you from rainy Tacoma, Washington, where I teach 9th and 11th grade math at the Annie Wright schools here.
Very good. Thank you. Welcome. And arguing along with him is an educator who's been involved in mathematics education for 25 years, an author on the Envision Mathematics K-8 program published by Savas, who believes that each and every student has important mathematical ideas and works to share his passion and love for mathematics with teachers around the country. He's also an avid music fan and collector and currently houses approximately 1,500 vinyl records in his collection. Also, he is inclusive with people, but exclusive when it comes to trapezoids. It's Zach Champagne. Welcome back to the podcast, Zach.
It is so good to be back, my friends. Thanks for having me. My name is Zach Champagne. I hail from Jacksonville, Florida. I hope you won't judge me before you get to know me by that little fact. I teach in a multi-age classroom right now, 3rd and 4th graders. When those beautiful creatures go off to their enrichments, I also teach a section of 8th grade comprehensive math. So I get to work with some 8th graders as well.
That's awesome. Welcome. And now the question we ask all of our guests, I want to ask both of you, starting with Gabe here. When did math first become controversial to you?
So I had a wonderful 7th grade math teacher, Ms. Bell. Shout out to Ms. Bell. She had an amazing kind of library of just books about math history and sort of, weird mathful facts and trivia. And she, sort of put them one by one into my hands, which was really kind of where I first started to think of math as something that I actually might want to do with my life instead of just something that I, was good at in school. But one book I remember, there was a book of mathematical scandals kind of throughout history. And it had a whole chapter devoted to, there's this kind of apocryphal story of the ancient Greek Pythagorean philosopher who first proved that the diagonal of a unit square was commensurable with its side. And, the story is that the Pythagoreans were so outraged by the facts that there could be irrational numbers that they threw him into the sea and drowned him. The book kind of related this all as historical fact. And, of course, it turns out there's no real evidence that it happens. But I loved the idea that someone could be so upset about a mathematical proof that they would drown someone over it.
Very good. Thank you. And bouncing over to Zach, when did math first become controversial to you?
Yeah. So, I've been on this podcast before and told the story when math first became controversial for me. So I'm going to tell a different story today, if y'all will allow it. As some of you might know, I have the privilege of talking at a number of math conferences across the country. And I begin each one of those conversations with a disclaimer. It explains who I am and what I believe. And it stems from me being a straight, white, cisgender male from Florida. And sort of acknowledging that holds some baggage for a lot of people, rightfully so. And the gist of this talk is that this introduction is that I see structural racism. I acknowledge white supremacy and the role that it plays in our community. I stand with the LGBTQIA plus community as an ally and co-conspirator. And ultimately, my message in that opening is that I work to include all those voices in my classroom intentionally, and particularly those that come from communities that have been intentionally excluded from many math classrooms. And there are times when there are certain people, particularly in certain geographical locations, where that disclaimer does not go over so well. Florida being one of those places. And there are folks that walk out of the session at the very beginning of it. And then there are times where I get like cheers of support, right? Depending on the geographical place I happen to be in. And that math controversy is one that like so many of us are battling right now. And my place of privilege means that I interact with that controversy very differently than my friends and colleagues that don't look like or feel like or love like I do. And so just trying to acknowledge at the top is really important to me, but also acknowledging that like not everyone feels that way. And that's a tough sort of space. So
Thank you for sharing that, and welcome to you both.
We have a team of two awesome educators arguing against the resolution, arguing that teachers should not follow the textbook. First up is a 21-year classroom veteran teacher with experience as a learning coach and a mentor teacher who has taught every grade 1 through 12 in a variety of specialties, including special education, instrumental music, science, and of course, math. She is the author of Unraveling School. She enjoys reading, writing, running, and baking bread. It's Melissa Dean. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, good to be here with you. So my name is Melissa Dean. I am coming to you from Niverville, Manitoba, Canada, which is a very flat, very cold prairie province just north of Minnesota. And amongst other things, I get to teach grade 9 math at the local high school here.
Oh, welcome, Melissa. And arguing along with her is a middle and high school math teacher, a GeoGebra ambassador, a former GeoGebra professional development director, an independent math ed consultant who demonstrates how many ed tech apps can serve as powerful platforms that effectively foster active, student-centered, and differentiated discovery-based learning. And a dad of 4 awesome boys. It's Tim Brzezinski. Hi, Tim.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on here.
Can you let us know where you are and what your current role is?
Sure. I teach middle and high school math here in New Haven, Connecticut. We are a district of about, I think, 90,000 students. It's huge. We're like the San Francisco of Connecticut. So we have a lot of ethnicities. It's really cool. I love working in an urban district because there's so much freedom for teachers to do what they love to do. There really is. I've been in several districts, but I feel like I'm home and I love it.
Well, welcome to you both. Now, the question we ask all of our guests: when did math first become controversial to you? Melissa, I'm going to start with you.
I had to think about this. So I have 3 sort of little mini stories about how math became controversial to me. So the first one is when I was a student in grade 12. And I don't remember which of my grade 12 math courses it was. In Canada, we have a different system than most of the United States curriculum. So I can't give you a connective curriculum to what course it was. But I do remember it was a math test, and it was one of those questions where you had a whole page to fill it in. And so you had your question at the top, and then you were given out the space. And when I got that test back, all that was on it was a big red no written all over the work on my page. And I remember at the time I was like, oh, okay. I didn't really internalize it. But then I became a teacher and realized how damaging that was to my math identity. And so I took on very quickly that I was not a math person, even though I was in math sciences in high school and I did my degree in science. And so I took math at the university level. But I never intended to teach math. I intended to be a science teacher and found myself teaching grades 7 and 8. And in Canada, you teach everything as a homeroom teacher. So I was tasked with, among other things, teaching grade 8 math. And I had a moment when I was standing at the front of my classroom dutifully with my textbook, writing example questions on the board. And I turned and looked at my students, and the look on their faces mirrored what my face had looked like when I got that big red no. And so I realized that there had to be a different way. And so I embarked on some self-directed PD. And the first book that I read was The Pie of Life by Sunil Singh. And that was when I realized there was a whole lot more to this teaching math thing than I thought there was. And it really opened my eyes to thinking about math in a new way.
Wow, wonderful story. Thank you. And Tim, why did math first become controversial to you?
Oof, that's a great question. It's funny because going through high school, I always know that I loved math and I never really had a problem with it. I hated English class, but I loved math class. But my teachers were kind of boring, and I'm like, there's got to be a way to make this more fun. So I always felt at odds with just like, come on, whatever. Then I go to college, fall in love with it even more. But then I student teach. And then after student teaching, I get a job in a pretty good district. But then within the first year, it's like I find myself making waves, not even trying to. I was making waves because from year one, I was always very progressive. I always wanted to learn how to, refine my craft and make it and do it better. But as I strive to just refine what I was doing to help improve, to make it more student centered and less me, the teacher centered, I found that I was making waves with some colleagues that were very traditional, very like, just this is how it is. This is how it has to be. And especially, God forbid, a couple of years later, you have a student like, a set of triplets where two of them are in my class and one's in another traditional teacher's class. And then it's like, I'm getting called to meeting after meeting, but I'm like, what am I doing wrong? And it's like, so I'm not, and it wasn't my heart to make waves, but it was just like, it was not my intention. But unfortunately, because I believe true to my heart and true to self and what I truly believe in with my student-centered philosophy of education, that I always found myself making waves, not even trying. So even in my first few years, I always found that it's been a controversial thing for me and unfortunately a few traditionalists around me.
Well, thank you both and welcome.
And with that, let's get into the debate. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have 2 minutes to present your arguments. And we're starting with the side arguing for following textbooks. Gabe, you are up first, and your time begins now.
Thanks, Chris. So I have really come a long way on this issue. I've really had my position change quite a bit over the years that I've been teaching. So when I started out, I really felt textbooks with their kind of formulaic alternation of example, exercise, and sort of contrived word problems, all these things were a big part of what I felt was wrong with math education, what I felt kind of discouraged creativity, discouraged problem solving, grasping for the big ideas, all the things that I really loved about math. And I felt like, well, I'm going to do better. I'm going to design my own stuff. I can do better than that. But, now that I've been teaching for a while, my view is pretty different. And I've come to see textbooks not as an impediment to good teaching, but as essential to it for a couple reasons, 3 in particular. First, I feel that trustworthy, high quality textbooks are really labor-saving tools for teachers that can make it easier for us to do the things that we already want to do instructionally. Second, I think it's really important that textbooks support the vertical alignment of curriculum, which has really important equity implications, making sure that students, all students, have access to the full learning sequence in math, no matter who or where they are. And third, I think textbooks really help support student agency. With older students especially, getting some practice reading and learning from a mathematical text can really help them become much more independent learners and set them up well for success. I'm never going to go to the mat for bad textbooks. And unfortunately, there still are a lot of bad textbooks out there. But we've also never had better access to high quality texts that support students in developing conceptual understanding, problem solving skills, and creative thinking. And many of them are free or low cost. As teachers, we're asked to do so much. And ultimately, I support textbooks because I feel grateful for all the help I can get.
Thank you, Gabe. Now we will hear from the side arguing against following textbooks. And we're going to start with Melissa. Melissa, you have 2 minutes, and that begins right now.
Great. So as part of my opening statement, I'm going to tell my story. When I first started teaching math, I did what I thought was what every math teacher did. I found the textbook and the teacher's guide, and I opened it to lesson 1.1. Here we go. This was my math lesson plan. Do the example problems on the board, have students read them, Make a note based on the teacher's guide script and assign practice problems. Then assign the homework. Start the lesson tomorrow by taking up last night's homework. Sound familiar? It did to me. It was the way I was taught math. And let me tell you, it didn't work. I was a struggling math student. Ask me to copy a procedure and follow the predetermined steps. You got it. Ask me what any of it meant. No sweet clue. Ask me to apply it to a new situation that wasn't like the textbook example. No idea. I was doing math, but I wasn't understanding math. And my students were having the exact same experience. One day I looked out at my students and I saw that some of them were feeling like I had as a student. I knew that facial expression. I knew those feelings. And so I decided that there needed to be a different way. I put down the textbook, I put away the teacher's guide, and I set out to try and teach math in a way that made sense to my students. Why did I ditch the textbook? Well, I realized something crucial. The textbook wasn't written with my students in mind. Oh, it was written with some mythical student in mind, but not my students. It didn't take into account my students and what they needed, who they were, what their previous experiences with math were, what their individual strengths and weaknesses were. And this is the main reason I think we need to keep putting down the textbook and the teacher's guides and teach math in a way that's responsive to our learners. To really understand math, we need to go deep down into it. We need to breathe it in. And the textbook lesson plan just doesn't do it. And let's be honest, those pages in the textbook, they aren't lesson plans. They are a set of predetermined math questions designed to get students to mimic the steps laid out before them, giving students a false sense of success. And this, paired with traditional mathematics assessment practices, I believe, is a recipe for mathematical disaster.
Perfect. Thank you. And now back to the other side, arguing again for following textbooks, we'll hear from Zach. Zach, you have 2 minutes. Your time begins now.
All right, full disclosure, friends. As you heard, I'm an author on a major math textbook, so I'm biased. Let's get that out of the way right now. However, I'm also a classroom teacher of 25 years, and a classroom teacher who also follows a major math textbook. So I can speak firsthand about how and why I think teachers should follow a textbook. So let's start by acknowledging that textbooks are far from perfect. However, they're an incredible guide that can support teachers across the continuum of their experience and comfortability with the teaching and learning of mathematics. I can say firsthand that the authors on many of these programs are leaders in our field who have studied math education for decades. And I can attest that they spend a copious amount of hours thinking about the scope and sequence at any given grade level. Now, for elementary teachers like myself, who teach multiple subjects, including math, writing, reading, science, humanities, and more, asking them to develop a scope and sequence, find lessons, gather materials, think of great questions to ask in the moment, and create and assign homework, if that's your thing, for one, much less 5 or more subjects, is just beyond the pale. I believe that leads to greater inequities in our field and for our students. Now, some teachers will thrive in that space, but many of them will not. This is going to lead to pedagogical confusion for students, as each teacher in each new grade level and within a grade level will likely be changing the way in which they're introducing and learning a concept and or skill. Look, I would be quite lost in creating and or even altering a set of language arts curricular materials. When I teach writing, I still literally have the manual in my arms and it makes me a better teacher. But it's also true for me in math. Yeah, I know the content and pedagogy well enough that I can ebb and flow a lot more fluidly with it, but I still want and need the curricular materials to help me drive my instruction in an equitable, sequential, and powerful way. Let's be clear. Gabe and I are not here to argue or advocate for pacing guides or any expectation that a given teacher is on chapter 5, lesson 3 on March 12th. We're talking about using a set of curriculum materials that guide this incredibly challenging work that we get to do each and every day.
Thank you, Zach. And finally, arguing again against following a textbook, we have Tim. Tim, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
Okay, thank you. So again, a textbook, when it comes to curriculum and textbook, I mean, we have to be clear, and I think we could all agree here that a textbook in and of itself is not a curriculum. It does not constitute a curriculum. But unfortunately, many teachers, they get the textbook and all of a sudden it's like they're married to it. I've worked in school districts. I've in districts of where I've worked teaching full time, and also in numerous ones I've consulted in the last few years. Teachers are so glued to the textbook that they come and, oh, I'm doing section 4.2. I'm on 4.4. I'm on 4.6. Where teaching and learning, the dynamics of teaching and learning, sadly, become more about what the teacher's doing and not what the students themselves are doing. And if I can quote Harry Wong, The First Days of School, a book that I read over 20 years ago when I first started teaching, he said in the book, quote, learning has absolutely nothing to do with what you as a teacher cover. It has everything to do with what the student accomplishes. And teachers, unfortunately, most teachers that follow a textbook, they don't have that mindset. It's all about what they got to get through. We got to get through here by Friday. I got to get through here. Kind of like what Zach just said, you know what, again, what he's arguing against, but it's just like, but that's the thing. And when it comes to curriculum is a fluid document. It will change, and it always has changed. It changes based on the needs of the students that are coming in. COVID was a big indicator of that a couple of years ago, right? Talk about vertical alignment. It's like we had to shove them up, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. So curriculum is like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you start painting one end of the bridge and you finish on the other side, guess what? The side you started with is starting to peel again. We need revisions after revisions after revision. And so the problem is that a textbook, when a textbook has been in a district for so many years, it creates a static mindset of curriculum for so many teachers that vertical alignment becomes almost like something that teachers are resistant to, because I just want to stick to the book and I don't want to have to veer off, that kind of thing. So unfortunately, I've seen textbooks take the traditional teacher and make them so much more traditional that those who are truly creative and want to be creative, I find hindered. But there's a lot of others, but I know I'm done. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all for that. And it's a great start. We're off to a good start for this conversation. I heard lots of good things, and I hear both sides kind of saying, like, definitely there's no perfect textbook. Like, we can't all follow one and everything can magically change. No one has all the answers, of course. But there's a lot of nuance in what you're all saying. And so I'm just thinking about, like, kind of building off some of the things Tim was saying at the end here. Like, if you're working at a school and you have a textbook, I'm going to give this to Gabe and Zach here. Are you like stifling a teacher's creativity or their ability to like adapt from year to year to different things? Like, how do we do what you want, follow the textbook, but also allow for some flexibility in the teacher?
Well, from my point of view, I think that can vary, right? And I think it has a lot to do with, the administration that you're working under and the culture of the school and the culture of the department. But I don't think it has to necessarily feel stifling or feel limiting. In fact, a big kind of aha moment for me in my own career was realizing that, the textbook was a resource, and it could actually make it easier for me to do some of the things I wanted to do anyway. And I think, even though I think it sounds like we all agree that there's a wide, well, maybe we all agree, I shouldn't assume that there's kind of a wide range of quality of textbooks, right? I mean, I think certainly we've all of us seen textbooks that we would agree are not good textbooks, and yet even there, so I'm have taught in the past out of books that I don't consider to be great, but I was fortunate to be in a context where I didn't have an administrator kind of breathing down my neck to be like, well, did you get to this lesson by this date? And what I could sort of use it for was, I'm going to still teach the lessons I want to teach. I'm going to still have my students working on interesting problems that drive engagement and that get them thinking about the deeper ideas. But then also I recognize there's a need for just kind of practicing skills. Like, there has to be that balance of those two things for students to really have access to higher and higher level math. And if I didn't have the textbook to just use to take care of that practice for me, I would have to be spending a lot of time, Googling for worksheets or writing my own practice problems or kind of doing my own stuff. And that would be time taken away from my ability to plan those more engaging, inventive lessons that really felt like a better use of my time. So in that sense, I didn't find it stifling.
Yeah, let me go to Zach too, if you want to add on to this. I'm just like, I'm imagining you, Zach, you said you were holding the book while you're teaching. Like,
yeah, is
it not going to force you to be like traditional or like direct instruction? Like, is that restrictive to you?
I here's what I think. I think of textbooks as a great equalizer. I think the folks in this room, obviously, we have a ton of experience in the teaching and learning of math. I think most of your listeners, if not all of them, are in the same space where if you could hand me just about any textbook and I can take it and make it into what I know and the way I want kids to learn, right? But also, we have so many teachers that are new to this profession or don't feel the same way that we all feel about mathematics, and handing them a textbook, it can be an equalizing thing to help them rise up to that. The other thing I'd like to say real quick on this is that like having a textbook for me allows me to utilize my planning time to focus on how I'm going to facilitate the content, not what the content should be. And I think that's the equalizer for me, which is if we're all just guessing what comes next, you're creating a lot of inequities based on what we know about our trajectory of mathematics over multiple years, if not pre-K through post-secondary, right? So when I have a book in my hand, I'm better able to focus on my kids and not myself. I'm not so worried about what comes next. I'm worried about how do I take this stuff that's here and make it how I want it to be for my kids.
But can I ask who authors the curriculum? The textbook writers or the district? That's my key, because the district should know. Again, I'm just saying, the district knows what the needs of the students are. The teachers that work on vertical alignment, the teachers that work on curriculum in the summer or whatever, they're the ones that are making these decisions and what's in the best interest of these students because they know them. But if you two are saying, well, we follow the textbook. I know we're not. I know you're not saying follow blindly, but the thing is, it's like to follow a textbook, right? Well, if there's certain gaps, there's certain things that students need, but this textbook is not addressing. And then the teachers, we got to pull from another source. It's almost like, like I said, I believe a textbook's a great supplement, but when we just take it and go with it and tell it like a story, today's textbooks are, if you ask Sunil Singh, like today's textbooks are not written like a story. They're written like the way publishers want them. Facts, facts, facts. And yes, there's some cool activities and great things in a lot of them, but there's a lot of disjoint and there's a lot of not, I don't know if I'm making sense, but the more that the teacher follows a textbook, I've always found that it's like the less creative that teacher gets because they're always depending on that. And again, a lot of teachers need that. I understand, but I'm thinking of the teachers that go in there, they want to try something. And especially those with tight-fisted administrators, they don't have the freedom and flexibility to do that because of the almighty textbook.
I'm going to come back to the admin question in a second. I want to first come to Melissa and then Tim. Kind of building off what Zach just said, I want to ask about like the new teachers and like thinking about all the teacher turnover that's happening right now and the shortage of teachers. Like if you're at a school and someone new comes in, how can you communicate clearly what is taught in different years and what they need to cover in that curriculum or that course they're teaching clearly and thoroughly and set them up for success if you don't have any textbook for them to like fall back on?
So the system might be different for me in Canada than it is in the United States. I think we use the word curriculum in a slightly different form. In the province that I teach in and across Canada, each province, which is sort of like our states, if you're not familiar with how Canada is divided up, each province has its own provincially mandated curriculum. And when I say curriculum, it doesn't mean like lesson plans. It's like, here's a set of objectives you're going to teach at each grade and some suggestions on how to go about doing it. So if I'm looking for what did they learn last, or what were they supposed to learn last year? What are they going to learn next year? What's the progression of skills? That information is actually like handed to me as a guide that I can go through. I can also, look it up online if I need to as well. So we have this progression put together already. So for a new teacher, like when I was new to teaching math, I, was like, what am I supposed to teach them? I didn't actually go to the textbook, even though there was a textbook and teacher's guide. I went to my curriculum document and it told me what skills I needed to teach, what the progression of where they were going to fall in line with what's happened prior and what was going to happen next. And so even with new teachers and even myself, I'm new to teaching grade 9 math, relatively new to teaching grade 9 math. I taught grade 7 and 8 math for 16, 17 years. So I taught that with not with ease, but I was quite familiar with the content. Being new to teaching grade 9 math, right? We have some textbooks in the building and I use them sparingly to look for problems. We're talking about we need to have practice. Students need to practice math skills, certainly. But my information as far as what my kids need to know comes from my curriculum document and then who they are sitting in front of me. And then I can take bits and pieces from the textbook and bits and pieces from other places, mindful of, I think we would all agree, as we've said, there's lots of terrible textbooks. There's some pretty darn terrible worksheets and other sources where you can find unvetted teacher resources that are used rampantly in the classroom. So I certainly think we need to have support for ourselves and for new teachers. I just don't think it's pulling the textbook off the shelf and flipping through in particular in the order that the textbook has decided, because it may not be the order our students need.
Yeah. And Tim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, interesting enough, because Zach and Gabe were saying, like, listen, a textbook has a wealth of practice problems for students, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, this is not an argument I could make 15 years ago, but any problem that's printed in any textbook, all the student needs to do is just go to Google and start typing in the word problem word for word, and I guarantee you somebody out there has already solved it already. They'll find it. They go to Wolfram Alpha for just the naked skill questions, or even the application word problems, right? drmath@yahoo.com or whoever, someone solved it somewhere, and they always find it. So it's imperative for today for teachers to be able to create their own questions. And again, I know I'm not here to promote a site or depromote a site, but there are a lot of sites that I go to find more open-ended questions that still assess my students' ability to demonstrate mastery of the objectives without having them easily be able to Google it, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, it's very hard for especially new or experienced teachers to find those problems in textbooks, because anything that's either printed, either on paper or online, is once it's published out there, someone solved it and the solution's out there, the kids don't want to find it. So what learning is truly taking place?
Nice. And I want to come back down, because Cindy brought up the admin question, and I'm going to stick with Melissa and Tim for this. I'm going to come back to this side in a moment, but in both sides of this. So like, Melissa and Tim, if there is an admin who is like requiring teachers to use textbooks, and if you're working there or someone you know is working there, like how do you help a teacher work with that admin if they're being required to follow it with, somewhat strict rules of some sort, and how do you as a teacher work with that or work within that system?
I think if I was working in that system, and certainly I've been in schools where it was that system, and I was a new teacher, a younger teacher in that period of time. I think the key is if we're in that situation where we're being told we need to follow the textbook with fidelity, in order, what have you, I think we still use it as a supplement. I think we still take it as our inspiration. I think just like, I'm also a humanities teacher, so I get to teach history and geography and teach some science and I teach some English and some all those other things. My science textbook isn't my lesson plan. It's not my curriculum. I might open the science textbook and say, okay, what's the next topic the textbook has suggested? And then use that as inspiration for what do my students already know about this topic? What do they need to know next? And how are they going to get there? Because those are the three questions that we always need to be asking ourselves. So the same sort of thing, we use a textbook as that foundation, but not only, because I think one of the great, I was going to say tragedy of our times is the sense of we have to get into a spot where we're being responsive to who our learners are and what they need. And like I think as Tim said in the beginning, it's got to be about what are our students doing, not what we're doing, and what does the learning look like and how's that being manifested. So certainly the textbook is there. If you have to do lesson 1.1 today and lesson 1.2 tomorrow, great, but it doesn't need to be a script.
And if we think about it, who are the textbooks really written for? The teachers, right? I have never in my whole career, I rarely have seen a student actually read a math book, like a modern one, like, example 2, look at this. There may be 1 or 2 out of every few thousand, but I ask kids, like it just collects either dust in their locker or it's just a virtual thing that they never really look at, So, but I see teachers will refer to it, they'll take stuff, but again, even teachers that follow a book that even if their administration tells them to, they're really actually using it as a heavy supplement to what the district says. Oh, hey, these are the objectives students need to learn. So it's like, but the thing is, like when teachers do that, it's like, oh, the book is the guide. The book is the guide. I don't know. The district documents the guide. And so how do you take that book and adapt it to whatever? And to answer your question, Chris, administrators that you have to teach out of the textbook require it to, fine. You know what? In a formal observation, you might want to steal an example or 1 or 2 from the book to make them happy, but you're not there to please your administrator. You're there to do what's in your student's best interest.
Of that. And I'm taking the other side now. Similar question about the admin, but kind of on the other extreme. Like I've worked at many schools in the past 20 years, and some use textbooks, some don't. And one of my more recent experiences, there were no textbooks, and my colleagues were really anti-textbooks. And so what would you say if you just your colleagues, if they don't want to use textbooks, if admin doesn't encourage it, doesn't want to buy it, like how can we use it or find something to use to kind of go along with what you're saying?
I'm going to answer a sliver of that question and maybe leave some space for Gabe to jump in on the other part. But like this, like, how do I convince my colleagues who are anti-textbook? Maybe I'm going to live in that lane for a second. You know what? I'll go back to that in my mind, great equalizer comment, which is it is an equalizer, I think, for teachers along the spectrum of experience and comfortability with the teaching and learning of math. I think it can be a really great support for teachers who are new to it. I would also try to make the case that having these support materials in front of us, and I think there's a nuance here, right? I think, Tim, we're like saying the same thing in different ways, right? I refer to them as curriculum materials, and by that I do mean the textbook. And I think curriculum, the way that Melissa's talking about it and Tim's talking about it, being more like what the district is providing us as like the framework there. But like for me, curriculum materials are way more detailed, at least my experience has been, are way more detailed and in depth on providing me the actual like support in the moment to do that. And so I think for teachers who are resistant of that, I always tell them, like, take what you want from these materials. And I hear Melissa and Tim saying that same thing, right? Like, use this as the resource that it is. And then for those people who need something like that, you have materials in front of you. So I think that's how I sort of work to try to convince people who are anti-textbook that maybe there's some support there.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that, Zach. And I mean, I think my experience has been, I certainly have been in that situation. That was my first big teaching job. Was I kind of, when I was teaching in New York City, it was like we had no textbook, and in large part that was not a intentional choice as much as it was there just weren't resources. And I was very comfortable in that space because my math content knowledge was good. And again, I had all these ideas coming, kind of, a young brand new teacher, naive, only could, right? I had all these ideas about what I wanted to do differently. But a lot of my colleagues, I think, really struggled with that situation and really were, my experience was not that they were not using textbooks because of a reluctance to use textbooks, but rather that they were not using textbooks because there were none. And, what happened, is that essentially the state exams came to de facto serve the role of textbooks. New York State has these very, structured kind of regents exams that correspond to every class year. So you have your Algebra 1 regents, your Geometry regents, your Algebra 2 regents. And those all come with, yes, there are sort of content guides, but also, of course, there's lots and lots of sample questions. And so what a lot of teachers ended up doing was they just took the sample questions and kind of worked backward from that. And their whole class was geared around preparing students for this one exam. And I don't think, that led particularly to better teaching, certainly not more, kind of creative or student-centered teaching. Than if we had access to some sort of, some of the stuff that I see available now, like, again, not to sort of promote or endorse any particular product, but when you look at stuff like Desmos is putting out now, or the Open Up stuff, where they're, they really do provide lots of really great kind of thinking rich tasks for students to be working on. I think a lot of my colleagues at the time could have really benefited from that. They may have been open to teaching more in that way if they had resources to help support that. And so I think that's kind of textbooks at their best. I know I've wandered off topic.
And Gabe, can I just add to play with Tim's comment a little bit? Like, those good programs, I would argue that those textbook problems are ungoogleable. Like they are good problems that you can't just search to find answers to, because they are less about performance and more about thinking and ideas.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit because, all the conversation so far has been about like what's in the textbook in terms of the practice problems and the content, things like that. I'm wondering, what about like teachers who are coming in, or new teachers are coming in, or teachers who need support with things like best practices that follow research and evidence, and math language routines and instructional routines? So if they need support there, I'm actually going to go to Tim and Melissa first. What would you say, or how could you guide teachers who, instead of using a textbook, uh, where could they find those things?
Well, again, I'm not by answering, I'm not here to endorse or not endorse a certain platform or product. I know it's not the intention of this platform. I want to make that clear.
Mhm.
But I'm just speaking objectively that I do use a lot of resources from a lot of different places. GeoGebra, I use a lot of Desmos, Mathagon. For students who struggle with procedural fluency in algebra, I use Graspable Math. Like it's an app, those have been absolute game changers for my students. I also go to Robert Kaplinski. Again, I'm just being objective. I'm not promoting. I'm just saying what I do. I go to Robert Kaplinski's Open Middle site. I see that book in the back there, Open Middle Math, right behind you there. But there you go. Yep. But like I have used a lot of those as actually assessment questions for a lot of students, where students could be either creative self and demonstrate knowledge of the objectives in very meaningful and alternate ways. All right. Again, textbooks. Yeah, I might steal an exam question from a curriculum that we have or whatever. I'll throw it on a quiz or a test. Sure. But I encourage teachers who looking for support and who are looking for like, how do I really engage my kids from when I start to when, I just tell them like, take one tool and like learn it as best as you can. Of course, I'm partial to math apps, but I just find that there's so many there's so many cool means through which we can do that. Sure, a lot of people can learn by reading or watching an example on a curriculum, but to just go to Desmos's or GeoGebra's geometry tool and just start playing with the circle tool, what do you notice? What do you wonder? You can have a lot of aha moments there that you can't unfortunately often find in a textbook that often unfortunately is like pre-scripted, step 1, step 2, step 3. It's still student centered, but we're still holding them by the hand, which some need to be. But again, there's a lot of other students who don't need that hand holding. And I think teachers struggle to give up control to the students, that gradual release and responsibility that states talk about in their framework to give them to the students. The more they hold on to the textbook, the more hesitancy I find that teachers are willing to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Melissa, before you respond, one of the things that like I'm seeing now in curriculum resources is what I call them as well as that. But when we look at these like curriculum resources, these textbooks, some of the newer ones actually explicitly call out like certain math language routines or certain instructional routines, things like Notice and Wonder that, many of us that go to a lot of conferences, we're very familiar with. But there are so many other educators that don't go to these conferences. So like things like same but different, and which one doesn't belong, and like how are we able to help support teachers who aren't familiar with that without the use of a strong textbook that actually has that stuff already built in?
So I want to give a bit of a perhaps like non-answer or sort of a seemingly fluffy answer to this. But to be entirely 100% honest with you, where I started when I first started becoming a math teacher and realizing that I needed to be, my heart was for student-centered mathematics education. The place I went to was where I found out all you people. And that's Twitter. So I found the best mathematics community when I was 10, I guess more like 15 years ago now, when I first started becoming a math teacher. Now I know Twitter has changed a lot. And I'm, don't want to talk about whether it's X or it's Twitter or whatever. But all of my knowledge about things like those math language routines that you just mentioned, like noticing and wondering, same but different, which one doesn't belong, I found those on Twitter. And I found those through a math teacher community that was built there. And I think, we're not here to debate about what state Twitter is in right now. But all the things that Tim mentioned, the resources that he mentioned too, are all things that I direct my new colleagues towards. But the very first thing that I actually ask when I'm doing coaching around mathematics education, and we haven't talked a little bit about it, and I know it's maybe a bit of a tangent, but before we decide what our instructional strategies are going to be, we have to be clear on what our assessment strategy is. We have to know what we believe about what assessment means and looks like and is for in a classroom. So when I'm working with new teachers, or even working with my, colleagues who are veteran teachers, like before you pick a math resource, you have to be clear on what role it's going to play in your assessment practices.
And going to the other side, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about like standards. So, each in states and I guess provinces as well, have these standards, right? If a teacher like fully knows the standards and understands the standards that the kids are supposed to be teaching or learning, I mean, what's the point of a textbook? Like if they already have this knowledge and they already know like where they should go, why would they need to have a textbook? So I'm gonna start. This is going to Zach and Gabe.
I think Gabe has a great argument for this. So I'm just going to say one thing and pitch it over to him. But this is the lovely part about all this is the nuance, right? But like, don't we, I think we all agree, like, isn't this a both and, right? Like, what if we provided professional development, professional learning for teachers to know about all the resources that Melissa and Tim just mentioned? And we also gave them a textbook, right? Isn't it both of those things that I think we all really want, right? So like, for me, that is the answer here, right? Because then when you get to a lesson where you're like, well, this is kind of boring, I'll go grab an open middle problem, or I'll go do a notice wonder today and we'll do a 3-act task that follows, right? So it's a both and I think Gable probably has a really good argument about the other things that textbooks offer that these other things don't. So
yeah, thanks, Zach, for teeing up the ball. But no, I mean, I do. I mean, I think you could sort of have a back and forth debate on the merits of using textbooks as a scope and sequence, essentially, which is, I think, kind of what you're asking about. But even if you sort of want to put that entirely to the side, I think there's a lot of other things that textbooks can sort of add value around that have nothing to do with a scope and sequence or a kind of a pacing guide or a list of content to cover. So I think, and this is something I really feel as a teacher who, I'm prepping 3 different classes and I'm struggling to spend time giving students really good, high quality feedback. And I'm struggling to, I'm trying to spend time being involved in my school in kind of other ways and all these other things. I want to be doing it all. I want to be delivering lessons every day that include, rich, cognitively demanding tasks and, kind of highly engaging, student-centered lessons, also making sure that students are getting enough skills practice, also making sure that students are getting good kind of like spiral review. We know, from research how important that kind of spaced repetition is for students. Also making sure that students, I'm not kind of like missing anything that students are going to need, in the class that mine articulates into. And textbooks can provide all of that. And especially, I think sometimes a lot of the assumptions that we make about textbooks are that the textbook and the teacher are somehow in conflict. Either the textbook has been like imposed on the teacher by the district or, by an administrator, or, it's kind of lying around and, the teacher maybe wants to do their own thing. But I think if you are lucky enough, and I recognize that this is not nearly as common as it should be, but if you are lucky enough to be in a situation where you, as teachers, have some influence over what texts your department or your school obtains, and if you have a textbook that you really believe in and you can kind of trust the quality of, or even if you can get to like 70% of that, you know what I mean? Even if you don't, you're not 100%, this would be the exact text that I would choose left to my own devices. But hey, in a lot of areas, it's pretty good. It has some kind of clever, thinky problems in it. It has some good skills practice. Fine. That just makes it so much easier for me to just say, you know what? I'm going to outsource that stuff to the book. I'm going to spend my time doing other stuff to, make sure that my students are getting really quality feedback and, lots of one-on-one attention and kind of all this great stuff. And, that's value. So I think there's a lot of value apart from just, this notion of textbooks as calendars or scripts or, kind of standards documents.
I think I have just one last quick question here. Since you all represent such a wide variety of grade level experiences and things, I'm just wondering, how does the grade level we're teaching or the age of the students affect how much you think we should rely on the textbook, or if it does or does not? But like, is there any difference? And I'm going to open up to all four of you to jump in at any time.
Being as a high school teacher, I think one of the things I've noticed about mathematics high school teachers, and this is probably a gross generalization, but I think there is a pressure in high school to blast your way through the content so you can make sure the kids are ready for a grade, whatever. And so I think that I need you to repeat what the question is.
I just said how the different grade levels matter and how much you're following textbook, or is there a difference?
That's right. Okay, good. Thanks. So as I was saying, I think that at the high school level, there is a higher rate of pressure to cover content in a short period of time, especially if you are in a semester, like a semester school. I got to teach grade 9 all year. The other math courses are semesterized, but grade 9 math in my school building is a whole year course. So I don't feel the exact same pressure, but I think that because there's that pressure to get through content in the high school level that I've felt, using the textbook at the high school level, I think there's more pressure to do that because you only see your students for half a year. You see them for a long period of time each day, but I think there's more of a pressure to follow the textbook at the high school level, especially if people aren't familiar with the content. So like when I taught grade 7 and 8, I wasn't as worried about, we're not going to say I wasn't as worried about content, but when I taught grade 7 and 8, my focus was on getting my kids to be good math learners in the broad sense of the term, like how to be a learner. What does that look like? And the content was maybe the vehicle that I did it through. But as moving into the high school system, there certainly is more pressure. And I think that it means that you have to either know your stuff or have something that's going to get you through that stuff. And if that is the textbook, then that's where it is for some people. So I want to say this may be out of my bias as being a high school teacher, but I think the impact of the textbook is greater at the high school level.
I'm curious, anyone else have any thoughts on that?
My bias will show too, Melissa. I feel like if I remember right, you've taught grades 1 through 12. Is that right? Nobody said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm 1 through 8. I've taught every grade 1 through 8. So I cannot speak to high school, but I would say I would be making the same argument that I'm making today for a first grade teacher that I would be making for an 8th grade teacher. I think it matters in both those places. I think they can provide support and guidance that other isolated things cannot. So I'd say I think it matters at all those grade levels. I will not try to speak on 9-12.
I think that's a good stopping point for our questioning around here.
We will now end by giving each side 2 minutes to make their final arguments. And we're going to begin first with a side arguing in favor of following textbooks, Gabe and Zach. Go ahead.
All right. So, I think a point of consensus that's really emerged for us is that quality does matter. And, when we think about all of the wealth of incredible, resources, tasks, best practices that we are so familiar with from Twitter and from conferences and things, wouldn't it be great if we had textbooks that could carry that and help support that, with teachers new to the profession or those who might not be so well plugged in, and have that really be something that's kind of leveling up their teaching. But we would argue, even a bad textbook provides some value, right? You get a free bank of practice problems. You get, a sense of kind of what the main things to cover are. And for any teacher, overworked, under-resourced, that's going to be valuable.
And I think I'd just like to end our argument by taking us back to this place of creating equitable and inclusive math classrooms. And I think what I worry about is when I hear Melissa and Tim and so many of our friends talk about like all of the amazing resources that those of us that are privileged to know where to find them have access to. I worry about the inequity that creates if there isn't some sort of level playing field for everyone. So I want to make sure we hold space for the opportunity, and we try to work to ensure that each and every kid has access to a progression that makes sense and isn't bumpy both pedagogically and from a content standpoint.
Thank you. And with the final word, we have the side arguing against following textbooks with Tim and Melissa.
Okay, so again, to reiterate, what we have said before, textbooks are good supplements to a curriculum, but they are not the curriculum. So when we follow a textbook, teachers that want to try something are often hesitant, and they are less likely to try something new because they have to follow the textbook. And when we talk about inequity and all the other things, like there are textbooks that still have example application problems that promote the inequity, especially in poor urban districts where you have an application problem about a rich family going skiing, and then someone in the class saying, "Yo, Mr. B, skiing is a rich white man sport." I've had that happen to me in years past teaching students in inner cities. So I've seen inequity come even out of textbooks. Unfortunately, they do exist, and especially within districts that have budgetary issues. And the problem that you're reading says estimate the population in 2015. Hello, it's 2023. Again, there's no perfect solution to any of this. I get it, but there are so many other free resources out there that many students. I know, again, I'm assuming that a lot of districts have internet access. I know not everyone do, but there are a lot of free resources that are high quality that are out there that are easily findable. Again, these are all supplements. The textbook is a supplement. All these great resources are a supplement to curriculum that is set by the district. But when we take one item, a textbook, and we find ourselves going to it again and again and again, our fear is that the creativity of teachers is stifled, and also students don't get the best possible education they could possibly get in that circumstance. Melissa?
I think one thing that comes to mind when I think about using a textbook is the reliance upon pre-written, like typing out your lesson plans and putting them in a page protector and putting them on a shelf. And then next year, what do? Oh, here's my September binder. You open it up, you pull out lesson 1 point. It's not written for the same students. A lesson plan that I wrote last year for teaching grade 9 math, I can't necessarily use this year because they're different kids with different needs. And so in my mind, what I'm mindful of when I'm thinking about using a textbook, and I really loved Zach's use of both and, because I think that's really where we're going here. But once it's in print, it's out of date, right? It's already
Static.
it's a static item. And as the years go on, unless we're constantly updating our textbooks, then we're going to end up with, in 5 years, we have a textbook that has a real world example that doesn't mean anything to anyone. So I worry about the static nature, and that it then we worry about having that static nature and the impact that has on the way learning is presented for our students.
Hey, thank you all. And that concludes our debate, giving us so much good stuff to think about. And I'm going to think more and more about how much I lean towards textbooks or not as I reflect back on this episode.
Yeah. And now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the arguments, share with your friends, and consider what resonated with you. Be careful. Textbooks is pretty controversial, especially in the teacher's lounge. Be sure to go to our Twitter at DebateMathPod to share your thoughts on this debate.
And again, huge thanks to all 4 of our guests. You were thoughtful, respectful. You showed that, we could disagree, but also agree on some parts of things. Like there's a lot more nuance and details to get into as we go through it all.
And thanks to those who are listening. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this.
And as we wrap up, Gabe, where can listeners find you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at gdavis451. I also just want to add a little disclaimer. All of the views I've expressed here today are my own and not those of my employer. But if you're a math teacher and you're looking for a summer job, I'll give one of my employers, and that's listed in chat out. Check out the Bridge to Enter Advanced Mathematics. Amazing organization.
We'll be sure to put Beam in our show notes there. And Zach, where can listeners find you?
Yeah, I'm on that thing called Twitter at Zach Champ. Zach is ZAK. And then the first part of my last name, which is Champagne. So it's CHAMP. So Zach Champ. Same thing for my website, zachchamp.com. I write over there. And if you ever find yourself in this not so lovely place called Jacksonville, Florida, I do hope you'll come visit a very lovely place called the Discovery School where I teach. A lovely place where we have kids from 18 months to a grade 8. We'd love to have you come to campus sometime if you find yourself in Jacksonville.
And Melissa, where can listeners find you?
Listeners can find me on Twitter and Instagram at the same handle, which is at dean_of_math. You can also find me at my blog, which is deanofmath.wordpress.org, .com, I think, actually. And you can also find some more about my ideas in my book that came out last year, which is called Unravel School. It's available on Amazon, and it just sort of fleshes out more of my ideas that something I've said has resonated to you. So feel free to check that out.
And Tim, where can listeners find you?
I'm all over the place. TikTok, Facebook page, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, X, whatever you call it. At TIM, B as in boy, R, Z as in zebra, E, Z as in zebra, I, N as in Nancy, SKI. You might have to hit rewind that if you really want to hear it again, but just Google it. You'll find something, but whatever.
We'll put it in show notes too. So everybody check out the show notes so you can get all the socials for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list and get your first set of example debate activities you could use with your students today. Go to luzniak.com/podcast.
Don't forget to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com or follow us on Twitter at debatemathpod and follow along with #debatemathpod.
Rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us.
Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you more next episode. Until next time, cheers.